Well, what's the story of your life? Is it a comedy or a tragedy? Comedy is something with a happy ending, fundamentally. And a tragedy is, well, it starts bad and gets worse. And is it a tragedy that someone else is imposing on you, or some bit of you that you don't understand? What's the story of your life? Part of that is, well, what do you want? What are you aiming at? That's the reverse of sin, right? You're aiming at something. What do you hope for? So the exercise basically assumes that you treat yourself as if you're someone that you're taking care of. So that's the presupposition. You're valuable, despite your flaws. It would be okay for you, and maybe all right for the universe as a whole, if your life wasn't any more wretched than it has to be. So we could set it up for that. Okay, so now, if you were looking 3 to 5 years down into the future, and you could have what you needed within the bounds of reason, what would it be? What do you want? What do you want from your family? What do you want from your friends? How are you going to educate yourself? What are you going to do for your career? How are you going to take care of your mental and physical health? How are you going to resist temptation? What are you going to do with your time outside of work that's productive and meaningful? You get to have it. It's like knock and the door will open. Okay, you've got to knock first. Well, and then you got to pick the door. And I really like this because you cannot catch something you're not pursuing. So now, if you're pursuing it, that doesn't mean you'll catch it. But generally, you'll catch something interesting along the way. That's the thing that's so cool about this. Let's say you set out a vision, you start pursuing it, you don't get what you were after. But you learn a lot as you move towards that destination. And as you learn, your vision is going to change, and you may end up with something that's better than what you were aiming at to begin with. But that won't happen unless you initiate the journey. That's partly something I learned from the Abrahamic stories, with the story of Abraham in particular, because God calls Abraham to an adventure when he's like 85. It's like, get out of your father's tent, for God's sake. Get out there in the world, right? Really, that's how the story is set up. Leave your family and your tent. It's time to get out in the world. Well, what does he confront? Famine is the first thing, tyranny, and the potential loss of his wife. It's like Abraham must have been going, it's like the tent's looking pretty good. But it's this call to adventure. Okay, so you put together a vision, that's your call to adventure. Get out there in the world and contend with it. Well, you might not get what you want, but you might find what you need. But it won't happen without the pursuit. And that's part of faith, right? Faith is, I'm going out in the world to seek my fortune. And if I do that properly, then the fates will cooperate with me. What you can do is make people more courageous. That's different. So even if you're treating people who are phobic, like agoraphobic, it isn't obvious that you make them less phobic. What is obvious is that you make them more courageous. So if you're treating someone who's agoraphobic and they won't go on an elevator, so they're afraid of an elevator, and you slowly expose them to the elevator, negotiating that, and they get to the point where they can get on the elevator, they're not really less afraid of death than they were. They're more confident of their ability to prevail in the face of adversity. And that you can teach that. And you do that by challenge. You do that through challenge. So if you want to build someone's self-esteem, let's say, but I would say encourage them, then set them a set of optimal challenges and allow them to watch themselves succeed at those challenges, and that will build it right into their bones. People think that the purpose of memory is to remember the past. And that's not the purpose of memory. The purpose of memory is to extract out from the past lessons to structure the future. And that's the purpose of personal memory. And so you're done with a memory when you've extracted out the information that you can use to guide yourself properly in the future. So if you have a traumatic memory, for example, that's really obsessing you, if you analyze that memory to the point where you figured out how you put yourself at risk and you can determine how you might avoid that in the future, then the emotion associated with that goes away. So memory has a very pragmatic function. And cultural memory is the same thing, is that we need to extract out stories from our past that structure our future. And we need that because, well, first of all, if you don't have a purpose, let's say, it isn't that your life becomes neutral in a meaningless sense. It's that your life becomes characterized by unbearable suffering, because the baseline condition of life is something like unbearable suffering. And what you have to set against that is a noble and worthwhile purpose. And hopefully, hopefully your determination of that purpose is buttressed to some degree by the wisdom of the past, because you can't conjure something like that up on your own. And if you provide people with nobility of purpose, then they can tolerate the suffering of existence without becoming entirely corrupted by it. And cultures that don't do that, it isn't even so much that they die, it's that cultures that don't do that are dead. They're done. They don't have a story anymore. They don't have a call to adventure. And then everyone suffers stupidly as a consequence. It's a very bad thing. So Churchill made the same observation that many of the great psychologists and philosophers made in the early part of the 20th century. It's like, bring the story forward and propagate it and make it the most noble possible story. And then you motivate people to transcend themselves, which they need to do. When people talk to me about watching my lectures, let's say, they basically say one of two things. If it's not just a simple thank you, they say one of two things. A third of them say, quarter of them say, when I listen to you talk, it's as if you're telling me things that I already know. It's like, yeah, well, that's exactly right, because that's what archetypal stories are. They're the description of what you already know. But that can be articulated, and then who you are and how you see yourself and the way you describe yourself all become the same thing. So that's wonderful. Then you're not at odds with yourself, and then you're a functioning unity, and that makes you much stronger and more indomitable than you would otherwise be. And then the other thing that people say, and this is more like 3/4 of them, is that they say, I was in a very dark place. I was addicted. I was drinking too much. I had a fragmented relationship with my fiancée, and I wasn't getting married. Things weren't going very well with my family. My relationship with my father was damaged. I didn't have any aim. I was wasting my time. Some variant of that, some combination of those. And they said, well, I've been watching your lectures. I've decided to establish a purpose. I'm trying to tell the truth, and things are way better. And so, let's say I've done maybe 8 or 9 large-scale public talks in the last 2 months, so that's probably 20,000 people, and about half of them, a third to half of them have stayed afterwards to talk to me, so that's about 7,000 people who have said that to me. And then people stop me on the street all the time and tell me exactly that story, which is just wonderful. Like, you can't imagine how good it is to be able to go to places you've never been and to have people stop you on the street spontaneously and say, look, my life is way better than it was. It's like, it's so good. And I've got 35,000 letters from people since last August. It's more than that. I can't keep track of them. And it's exactly the same thing. Like a quarter of them say, well, you've given me the words to say what I already knew was true. And thank you for that. I can see that in the audience. It's so interesting because I can lay out a story. People go like this and say, they're doing that all the time. It's like the lights are going on. And that's there's almost nothing better than that, to watch lights go on when you're talking to people. It's like, that's just absolutely fantastic. But to get this response from people, my father's about 80. I put him in charge of going through my viewer email, which is an overwhelming job, but we've had discussions about this constantly. He's overwhelmed by the fact that so many people are writing and saying the same thing. It's like, well, I have a purpose, man. My life actually matters. I finally realized that, and I'm putting it into practice. And I'm bearing up under the heaviest load I can imagine, and it's really helping. It's like, God. And that's tens of thousands of responses now. So you couldn't hope for anything better than that. There's zero harm in it, right? It's just people putting their lives together. They're not mucking about with other people. They're not trying to make broad-scale social transformations about which they have no idea. They're trying to make their immediate environment better. And it's working. It's like, great. Well, great. A journalist asked me why people are responding so positively to what I'm saying. The young men, for example. And I thought, why? Yeah, that's a good question. He says, well, I'm actually on their side. I'm really happy that they're not wasting their lives. I'm really sad to see that people are disenchanted and nihilistic and depressed and anxious and aimless and perverse and vengeful and all of those things. It's terrible. And then to see people question whether that's necessary and then to start to rise out of it. It's like, it's so fun. Like last night I was after my talk, it's overwhelming. I don't usually think about these things, but I was after my talk last night, and so all these people line up, and they have their 15 seconds with me, and they're kind of tentative. They're excited and attentive when they come up to talk to me, and then they have 15 seconds of time to tell me something. I'm really listening to them, and they're hesitant about whether or not to share the good news about their life, and I think it's often because when people share good news about their life, people don't necessarily respond positively. They don't get encouragement. And people need so little encouragement. It's just unbelievable. And so they'll tell me something good, and I think, God, that's so good. Somebody says, oh, I'm getting along way better with my father. I haven't seen him for 10 years, and now we get along. It's like, God, great. And then the power of that, you can't overstate the power of that for individuals to get their life together. The individual is an unbelievably powerful force, and every single person who gets their act together a little bit has the capacity to spread that around them. It's a chain reaction.